So in this lecture today, I'm going to be talking about the Sustainable Livelihoods approach, and then I'm going to give you two examples of how it's been applied. In the last couple of classes, we started to use the word sustainability. Now this term is very commonplace, but we really haven't had a chance to define it yet in this class. It was first used in 1987 with the publication of the Brundtland Report, in which it was defined as meeting the needs of the people of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In the indigeneity lecture, I also introduced this term called sustainable development, which can be defined as development that satisfies the needs of the present without compromising the capacity of future generations, thereby guaranteeing the balance between economic growth, care for the environment, and social well-being. I talked about how while sustainable development stems from people wanting to help people, it also embodies a top-down development approach. The Quechua example from our reading last week exemplifies this, as did my own work in natural resources management in Honduras in the Peace Corps. In the Quechua article, the WALG program sought to educate Quechua women in sustainable agriculture to help relieve population pressure and also habitat degradation. However, we have to recognize that the program was brought in by white non-natives who were developing the area. The culture pillar of sustainability is often compromised in a lot of these cases because outsiders bring in technologies that are designed to help people, but oftentimes these projects fail because the outsiders bringing in this technology fail to understand the complexities of the culture and the structure of the existing social ecological system. So the sustainable livelihood approach is another sustainable development framework that's been prominent since the 1990s through the present that attempts to integrate human rights, culture, and human well-being. It stems from the theory regarding sustainable development as a sustainable livelihood approach that incorporates collective concerns for environmental and economic resources and individual focus. Like the term sustainability, the sustainable livelihoods idea was also first introduced by the Brundtland Commission in that same report on environment and development and the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which expanded the concept, advocating for the achievement of sustainable livelihoods as a broad goal for poverty eradication. In 1992, Robert Chambers and Gordon Conway proposed the following composite definition of a sustainable rural livelihood, which is applied most commonly at the household level. A livelihood comprises the capabilities, assets, and activities required for a means of living. A livelihood is sustainable when it can cope with and recover from stresses and shocks, maintain or enhance its capabilities and assets, and provide sustainable livelihood opportunities for the next generation. And this then contributes to net benefits of other livelihoods at the local and global levels and in the short and long term. Originally, the phrase livelihood was used as an essentially descriptive device to show an understanding of the nuanced, complex, and diverse specificity of rural life, in which rural people and communities undertook a set of varying and different productive and reproductive activities, of which only one might be farming, in order to fashion a standard of living. In other words, people diversify their activities in a sustainable livelihood. Ecosystem services approaches and small-scale natural resource development systems, which was the focus of one of the articles last week, the King article, they've been criticized for underrepresenting key social dimensions and consequently providing faulty understandings and guidance to policy. Alternatively, the livelihoods approach focuses on capabilities encompassing tangible and intangible things that people are able to do or be, and from which one may derive a sense of well-being. So the sustainable livelihoods approach is therefore premised upon the proposition that poor people have assets, and those assets include things like natural capital, like land and water, physical capital, like tools and equipment, infrastructure, transport, shelter, sanitation, energy, financial capital, like income, savings, credit. Human capital, like education, skills, knowledge, and help. And then social capital, like households, networks, formal groups, institutions, and information. And these definitions are clearly stated right in the papers themselves. The livelihoods approach and the ecosystem services benefits cascade uses similar potential to actualization sequence from natural capital to actualized services and benefits, and from people's capacities to actualize livelihood outcomes and well-being. They derive sort of from these different epistemologies, ecosystem services. Those of you who took my intro class know that this is an economic valuation method of natural systems and the services that they provide. But the recent interdisciplinary elaborations of this benefits cascade framework that King et al. Bring out in the readings from earlier in this week talk about how they can be compatible. Within a particular context, people creatively employed these assets as inputs to construct a livelihood strategy assigned to improve a household's means of making a living. So in doing so, though, people have to, in many cases, carry out different productive and reproductive activities, or they have to diversify out of necessity based on the portfolio of assets under their control. So people, or an individual, or a household could simultaneously undertake a range of different activities and seek to achieve a range of different goals. So diversification is key, really, in this sustainable livelihoods approach. Sometimes these activities are conflicting. And so this implication is sort of explicit. People, and especially poor people, do not do just one activity, nor are they passively defined within social and cultural frameworks. Rather, people are active agents who articulate and seek to expand the boundaries of their capabilities, which can be defined as the effective freedom to make independent choices that are important to the individual. So remember those individual choice heuristics that I talked about in prior classes before spring break? At the same time, the range of agency available to people, right, the range of choices that people have to construct a living is mediated by institutions, policies, and processes of society, and that in turn also affects their livelihood assets. So the sustainable livelihoods approach really requires 4 key dimensions of sustainability. One is environmental sustainability, which we would see when the productivity of environmental resources is enhanced so they could be used in the future. 2 is economic stability, which could be demonstrated when a given level of spending could be maintained over time, or when an acceptable level of economic welfare could also be continued over time. 3, social sustainability would be achieved when social exclusion was minimized and social equity is maximized. And then there's institutional stability that could occur when dominant formal and informal institutional structures and processes could provide this livelihood enhancing function, right? So the idea is that the institutional sustainability would help promote social, economic, and environmental stability. And so part of the reason for the rise to dominance of this sustainable livelihoods approach is because of its recognition that poverty is multidimensional and it fosters creative responses among poor people of the world. So these expressions of agency produce not just material incomes, but also meanings and values, capabilities, and well-being. And so the sustainable livelihood approach is actor-oriented for rural development. And it eschews or negates these ideas of magic bullets, but rather stresses this concept of diversity, difference, and difference within, between household members. The sustainable livelihood approach emphasizes that we can be gradually brought about from below by individuals and households with the resources that they have in the markets in which they participate, however imperfect that they may be. So this is the main crux of the idea. It's basically trying to help people diversify their livelihoods and ways in which they can provide for themselves and maintain economic well-being and human well-being. And so you can see how this is an improvement on traditional sustainable development models that simply said, we're going to give this person this technology and they therefore will be prosperous and have maintained some livelihood. Rather, in this case, it takes into account the diversity of the world's people and the ways in which they use their resources and interact with their resources for economic profit and well-being. However, the sustainable livelihoods approach does certainly have some weaknesses. So although it's a prominent approach in the field of rural development studies, it can be criticized from several different perspectives. And the first one is that it sort of lacks attention to questions of wider power dynamics beyond the community level, right? So one of the things that we've studied this entire semester is that these interactions between resources, actors, local governance, regional governance, and maintaining social ecological systems are interrelated and they're scalar. And so we know that broader, more global processes can strongly restrict response capacities of local actors, right? So we think about like regional, state, or national scale or international scale governance questions can constrict individual decision-making of individual actors. So local political and economic actors may be subordinately linked to larger, more powerful political and economic actors, and this can affect the flows of goods and services and money brought into and moving out of communities. So both factors can strongly impinge upon the range of responses that local social networks can engage in and the agency that individuals and households have. So consequently, the livelihood options can be constrained or even imposed from beyond the community especially when outsiders explicitly limit local livelihood options. So that's something that's not implicitly integrated into the sustainable livelihoods approach. By focusing on the ways in which poor people could make better use of available assets to improve their living standards, this SLA approach promotes a simplistic poverty alleviation strategy, whereby the poor should help themselves. And so this is talking about coping mechanisms, really, and not necessarily on adaptation. And so that becomes problematic when we're talking about people who are living in a rapidly changing world in the Anthropocene. The sustainable livelihood approach also assumes that everyone has assets and all assets are equally essential. It sort of fails to ask who owns what, who does what, who gets what, and what do they do with it. And so that's problematic if some people do just some jobs, or if some people have only some resources, or if some people do only certain jobs. However, newer models, like those in the King et al. Paper, incorporate these ideas of adaptation and that choice portfolios are important determinants of individual and community abilities to adapt and maintain sustainable livelihoods in this uncertain future of the Anthropocene, right? So choices are now being incorporated into the sustainable livelihoods approach. And so the article that we read today sort of emphasizes some of these same ideas of Earth system governance, including reflexivity, adaptive management, and co-management, and all of those are really important to a path forward. So hopefully by listening to this exercise, you will realize that the sustainable livelihoods approach sort of encompasses these ideas of natural capital, financial capital, human capital, and social capital as being mechanisms for environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, social sustainability, and institutional sustainability that promote the well-being of local communities.